Okay, we will have the exams. We'll be back on Thursday. Two things that went on with it. One is in the future, I will not put the short answer and essay in the same exam as where I put the multiple choice and fill in the blanks. Because the way I grade them, you don't have to answer all the questions for the short answer and the essay. And the way the system works, if you don't answer a question because you don't have to, you get no points. So it really blows the grade out of the water because you don't have to do that. So what we'll do in the future is we'll set up the multiple choice and the fill in the blank as an online test. And then the essays will be just an assignment, and then just email it to me. I went through that and realized why people getting the points and they were still failing the exam, and because it's set up online and it's 151 points. And there are only 100 points on the exam. So we'll rework that. So it's taking a little bit longer to get them done. So we'll go on from there. Upcoming assignments. Paul Whitman, who's the Chief of Campus Security, will be here on the 28th. And he'll be doing a presentation on Newberry College's emergency management efforts. Be prepared to ask him questions. And again, I'm trying to arrange at least 2 more speakers to come in. Because as we talked, your big class projects is designing the emergency management plan. And so this is a good time to talk to folks that know about it and be prepared to do that. Our second exam will be on Tuesday, October 5th, which is the Tuesday before our fall break. It'll cover chapters 4, 5, and 6. It'll be online, but I'll be in the classroom. We had some of you that wanted to make sure you had good internet access, so I will be in classroom that day. So if it's better connectivity to come here and take it, I will be in the classroom. No problem with that. Critical Review 1 has been posted in coursework on Wolfden. It must be emailed to me to arrive before 9:15 on Tuesday, October 5th. Assignment specifics are posted under coursework. And what it consists of, as I've mentioned before, I have an article that was published in Australia talking about community-led emergency management, emergency preparedness. And that ties to one of the things we've talked about, is about how it's getting the stakeholders, getting everybody involved in designing it, the more effective your program will be. So as you go through and read it, the main thing is what you think really works well, what you really like about it, and which 1 or 2 of the issues that they talk about do you think could be easily used in the United States. Again, different culture, different background, different relationship with government. And if for whatever reason you don't feel any of them would work in the United States, then obviously defend your position as to why you don't think they'll work. But again, that's been posted, and the article itself is posted on the resources. I get it through the University of South Carolina Library, but since you don't have accounts, I can't get you the link to the article itself, so I post the PDF under resources. So it's available online, and I checked this morning and the links do work. It's a somewhat lengthy article that probably longer than a lot of you have read, so you may want to get started early on it. The due date is that Tuesday the 5th. There's no reason if you're done with it early, you can submit it early. But as long as I have it by that morning, the 5th, no longer later than 9:15, in good shape. So have a look, see, let me know if you have any questions, and we can talk a bit more about it on Thursday. So have a look, see, and let me know if you have questions. Again, it is from a different country, but I think there's some very, very positive efforts in there that would work well here. So go from there. And keep in mind that these critical reviews are just that. They're not book reports. They're not, this is what I read. What do you think about what was said? What do you think about the ideas they suggest? What works, what won't work? Why will they work or not work? So again, it's more than just a book report. Yes, I want some critical thinking involved in the process as we go forward. So have a look. See, finish reading or reviewing chapter 4 and begin reading chapter 5 and by extension chapter 6. As we talked in class last time, by doing the exams online, it takes away a class time we were going to spend using it. So it'll be more responsibility on you to make sure you do the reading and keep up with the information we talk about. Questions, comments, make sense? Quote of the day comes from page 73 of our text. The single most significant societal change that has most altered community preparedness has been the increased professionalism of local emergency managers. So that's a clue for what they talk about in Chapter 4, this professionalization of local emergency managers. And as you read through the text, there have been several challenges, and it's a work in progress. And it ties back to one of the challenges that we talked about, idea of emergency management, always learning from past experience. Learning to try to improve based on history and things that go on. And you see that in the evolution of the role of the emergency manager as we go through this. It's an evolution at work in the truest sense of the word. As we saw from the history of emergency management in this country, it was a shift from military focus to community focus. This idea that up until 40, 50 years ago was all about civil defense. After 9/11, it became homeland security. And as we saw in the video the very first day of class, they're realizing now that the military is good for some things, but not necessarily everything. And so using those. The shift from tactical to strategic planning, and we'll talk more about that as we go through, and we've talked about that in the past. And the shift from this notion of other duties as assigned to professional management. And in too many organizations, your text makes a big point of this, the emergency manager is an added duty. There's oftentimes with the sheriff's department or the police department or with the emergency medical technicians and whatnot, just as a state of convenience. And again, when you worked this summer, did they just give it as a separate duties assigned, or did they identify specific people that were going to have responsibility?
It was aimed at specific people. So we had environmental health and safety department, and they would run the EAP management.
Yeah. And so it became a responsibility. And again, we talked about this so many times, and your text makes points throughout about the politics of emergency management and local government, and at the state and federal level as well. And one of the things it talks about is getting the commitment of elected officials to follow through, which is completely different than the private sector, because when the boss says we're going to do it, they've got the resources and the people are assigned to make it happen. One of the challenges that even in some places, the face of emergency response is the chief elected official. Whether they actually have any background or experience or just a talking head, that's some of the things that are changing in the process. So again, the shift, as we saw within the whole field of how government responds from the military approach to a civilian approach, the shift from tactical to strategic thinking as we move forward, and this idea of having professional management in place. So again, key shifts that are taking place as we go forward. We talked about the traditional 4 phases, which were mitigation, preparedness, rescue, and recovery. And I like this quote from James Lee Witt, former FEMA director, who said that mitigation is the cornerstone of emergency management. First, what is mitigation? And second is, why would Witt say that it's the cornerstone of your emergency management?
Lessening the effect of the disaster.
Yep, and how do you do that?
By preparing people around, making sure supplies are stocked, and having the response ready to happen when it's needed.
Okay, so how is mitigation, the way you define it, different than preparedness?
In the way that you do it, you're trying to save resources while saving, or not save resources, but use resources, have resources ready to lessen the effect of the disaster instead of just being prepared to respond to it afterwards.
Okay.
Like, can I use an example that makes it easier?
Sure.
Like New Orleans with their levee system. That's mitigation.
Okay. Other thoughts? Charlotte, how does this fit in with you?
I think, with mitigation, but preparedness would be okay. It's coming like how prepared am I?
Okay, but keep in mind that there's a big difference between preparedness and mitigation. There's a big difference. Tristan, do you have any thoughts on the difference?
Mitigation, I guess mitigation would be like you already have something in place to make to lessen the damage of something. So I guess maybe this is, I don't know, like I guess the way you build a building.
See, that's a great example. Building codes are a great example of mitigation attempts, right? The way you build a building with the kind of windows you put in, the hurricane strappings, all those kind of things are designed to help limit or mitigate the impact of the disaster that's coming. So in some areas, you build on pylons above because you're worried about floods. So building codes is perhaps one of the best examples of mitigation because they're designed to help reduce as much as possible damage caused by any type of disaster. Okay? Janelle, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that mitigation is more like an action towards, what do you say? It's an action taken to eliminate risk from disasters and so on. And preparedness is being ready for when that happens.
Right.
So
Right.
mitigation just refers more to, for example, building plans and building codes, you've taken an action
Right.
for something that happens, and preparedness is just being ready. So I
See-
think mitigation falls into preparedness as well.
Right. I mean, none of these are in a way discrete functions. I mean, they blend into each other as we go through. But for instance, ways you can help mitigate on buildings is put in storm-resistant windows that aren't as likely to shatter. And they have research centers, there's even one in South Carolina that tests building codes against different types of natural disaster. In terms of, they'll do things like shoot 2x4s into windows to see if they shatter or if they're resistant and don't shatter and cause other damages. So this mitigation is actions you take beforehand to help minimize to the greatest effect possible the impact of storm or natural disaster on buildings and facilities. So mitigation example that you used was putting in the new levees around New Orleans was an attempt at mitigation to prepare in advance to help minimize and limit what goes on, which is a different function than preparedness. So why might James Lee Witt say it's the cornerstone of emergency management?
Base the rest of the other 3 steps on how much you thought through and mitigated as much as you could.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah, what you tried just through mitigation to minimize the impact of whatever's going to happen. You can't control what happens. And all the preparedness is great, but if you don't take steps beforehand, the action steps that we've talked about, right? And again, building codes is a great example. The levees around New Orleans are a great example of steps that are taken to try to minimize the impact of whatever comes along. And then preparedness is, okay, fine, now that it's hit, what resource do we have available? What things do we have pre-positioned and pre-planned to take care of? So it's a cornerstone in that the better job you do at mitigation, it's similar to the example we've talked about earlier in class, is how many fires does the best fire department put out every year? None. Because they've done such a good job in training and education and enforcing codes and whatnot, that fires don't happen. The problem becomes is how do you budget for a fire that doesn't happen, right? And that's how they count. So again, that mitigation is a cornerstone, and I think you've got a good sense of why that is. Preparedness, we've talked about, is just getting resources pre-staged so that you have sufficient quantities and qualities of things to make things happen. And then rescue is the immediate reaction to it, and then recovery is the long term, which takes place. And these are the traditional 4 phases. And one of the challenges is in some ways, take an individual, these are all tactical attitudes and tactical responses. And what the suggestion is under this new management, this new concept of professionalism, is that those are not discrete functions, right? They're part of an overall long-term strategic approach to dealing with disasters. So that's an important element that we go through. And the shift that your text talks about at great length is from the short-term response, which is tactical, to long-term perspective, which is strategic. You know, this idea that, and we'll talk about this a bit more, is that emergency management, if done well, should be value added for the community. And I'll get you to give me definitions of that in a few minutes. Okay. So this shift, this transition from military, very tactical approach, very incident-specific approach, to a broader perspective, and again, we saw that in the very first video, of having stakeholders involved, of having other things, and the role of the emergency manager evolving to one of management, and that's identifying resources and having those all pre-staged. Recognize that no government has the ability to handle everything, right? And we talked about Team Rubicon and the Cajun Navy as volunteer organizations during Katrina, during Ida, that came through and helped jump in where you know the resources weren't available from state or local government, but they used the big C word, which was coordination in the process that goes through, a very important part of that part. Your text talks about in figure 4.1, so again, all these figures are fair game for test questions. Okay, so this idea of basic preparedness functions, and we'll talk about this a bit more after we kind of go through the list about this idea of discrete functions as opposed to a multidisciplinary or distributive process. Okay. So the basic functions of preparedness is mobilization. What's mobilization mean? How, just in the general sense, would mobilization work? What do you mobilize? First responders. Right? Who else do you mobilize?
Victims from the disaster, so you get people out.
Okay, that would come more in protective actions, but yeah, I mean, you can see where you would want to get those involved. I just mentioned two other groups that were volunteer groups. Right? So the mobilization is not only the physical resources that you have at your disposal, but all of those resources you've included in your management plan. Volunteer groups, Red Cross, state agencies, churches, blood banks, whatever it might be that can provide a resource to immediately respond to that disaster is what mobilization is all about. Warning. What's a great example of that? Yeah, tornado sirens that, you know, and then, you know, emergency broadcast. What's another type of warning? Get out, evacuate. Right? I mean, all those kind of things that you let folks know that it's coming and take action in advance, you know, to try to warn you of what's going to happen. Either get out and leave, or make sure you have your stuffs available, your 3-day supply of food and water and medicine and things of that nature. Protective actions. Okay, what's a good word we just used? And we talked about actions you take in advance. Mitigation, right, is just a fancy word for that kind of stuff. And then, Aiden, what you were talking about, this caring for the victims. You know, that's all part of the functions that you do. Damage assessment, right? And why does damage assessment become important? Helps you allocate resources. Help prepare for future. But if you get involved in a car accident, what's one of the first things you need to do? After you notify the police. Huh?
You look at the cars and you figure out how
Yeah, and why do they do that?
So that they can tell their insurance company that you're not paying for it.
Well, no, I mean, it's to assess what it's going to cost to repair it. So damage assessment is not only that large perspective to help planning get an overall threshold of what's available, and also when you have an estimate of the damage, you can begin to see the scope of the disaster that goes on, but also from an individual basis, knowing what it's going to cost to fix a repair and dealing with your insurance companies and things of that nature. Restoration of public service. What might that include? What's one of the things that's in very short supply immediately after the Hurricane Ida went through New Orleans and is still plaguing like Laplace in some of those rural areas?
Electricity.
Electricity. You know, water, sewer, electricity, things of that nature that get to be these public services. But it also includes fire and rescue and sheriffs and law enforcement that get involved in the process. Informing the public. How might informing the public be different than warning the public?
You could be informing the public on your damage assessment.
Informing of the damage assessment. What else would you might want to inform the public about?
Restoration of public services.
Yeah, how that's coming along, what progress is being made. Okay.
I guess, actually preparing for the disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, informing the folks, and that's what we're going to do with our radio spot. It's coming up the end of October. You know, what do you need to have in mind? What do you need to keep? What considerations do you need to make, you know, in advance of any disaster that may come? So there's information. So information is not only after the event where the shelters are, where you can go to get food or water, things of that nature, but also in the beginning of the process, right? On what's available. Record keeping. Why is record keeping? Aiden?
An example that you gave us before was how they had to let people out of prisons because they didn't have the records.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
just in general, it keeps everything in order. So finding a way to mitigate it into like maybe having everything on an online cloud or something like that.
Yeah, most every state has procedures and rules for document storage and what has to be kept, the kind of location that it's kept, and that whole issue of document storage is to do what? Help prevent the loss of the information that goes forward. So that's an important aspect of it. Recovery planning, which an easy way to look at recovery planning is planning for recovery. Right? You know, all this confusing stuff we talk about in here gets to go forward. And we've already talked about this in a variety of ways as coordination of the different activities that go on. So make sure you review that and are comfortable. But the point that your text made is, remember, the functions listed are just functions. They are not necessarily the responsibilities of the emergency manager. What does that mean? I mentioned that a couple times already this morning. The functions listed are functions, not necessarily responsibilities of the emergency manager.
Just be something that should be known.
Remember we talked about the C word? Coordinating, yeah. So they would have overall responsibility for having a plan in place and getting all these in, but they then coordinating because they don't have the skill or the other personnel or whatnot be needed to do all these things. So these are functions that must be considered, but the responsibility for performing the function is not solely the responsibility of the emergency manager. That make sense? Yeah, so they would have overall management responsibility to make sure these functions are accounted for. But actually doing the functions would be EMS, would be the Sheriff's Department, would be volunteer organizations, would be those kind of things. And what has happened too often in your text makes this point, is that those functions were oftentimes looked at the responsibility of the emergency management folks to do these things. And that was back to this idea of a tactical response, back to this idea of the military hierarchical structure that we talked about. And what they're realizing is, no, you need an emergency manager who coordinates these things, that has the resources in place to do these things. But the actual carrying out the function would not be their prime responsibility. Does that help a little bit? Okay, yeah. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And again, as you go through those things, just remember that what we're talking about here, these are not things that have to be done by the emergency manager. And this is that shift from tactical to strategic thinking. And that gets an important element of what we're talking about as we move forward. Okay, what's a paradigm? And no, it's not 20 cents, okay? Let's get that out of the way to begin with.
It's like the ideal idea, the best idea or something.
Kind of, sort of. Any other thoughts on paradigms and what a paradigm is? Thomas Kuhn wrote a wonderful book several years ago on the revolution that is scientific advance. We don't think it's...
Would a paradigm be a new pattern, a new set of instances, or change in the way something works and how a new...
Yeah, that's what a paradigm... Yeah. But fundamentally what a paradigm is a dominant worldview. Okay. So Thomas Kuhn talked about this idea that scientific advances are not evolutionary, they're revolutionary. Because what he says is we have a dominant worldview, a dominant paradigm that controls how we look at the world. And it's supposed to be explanatory. And what happens is over time, events start happening that the paradigm doesn't explain. So people come out with alternate explanations as to why that stuff happens. But that's a challenge to the dominant paradigm, right? So actually a war then breaks out. And literally the old paradigm dies out and the new paradigm takes over. That new paradigm becomes a worldview. It's like in football, the first time somebody threw a pass. That was a change in the world, right? Because up until that time, all we did was run. Nobody thought about throwing a pass. And then we had to change. A new coach comes along with a new strategy or a new play that changes the way you did things in the past. Firefighting, new technology came along. And for those of you all interested, one of the most amazing paradigm shifts that's taking place is in physics. It's a shift from Newtonian physics to quantum physics. And why do we care?
Because science.
What's the major difference between Newtonian and quantum perspectives?
Physics major?
No, I mean, it's just amazing stuff. You know, Sir Isaac Newton, right? What was the big story about how he figured out gravity? Got hit in the head by an apple, right? And so the paradigm was cause and effect. If this happens, then that's going to be the result, right? And you saw that in psychology with a whole behavioral movement that says if you had these things happen, this is how you're going to behave. Cause and effect. Well, quantum physics doesn't talk about cause and effects. It talks about probabilities. And that if A, in Newtonian, if A, then B, in quantum, if A, then maybe B, but maybe C or D or E. Why is that important? Well, because that gets into this whole idea of psychology. Are we who we are because that's the way we're born and that's just nothing we can do about it? From a religious point of view, how can you have free will and yet still have predeterminism? You know, and we don't think about that, but that's a fundamental shift. And if you go back and look, now they're developing quantum computers. A lot of the advances we've had in electronics is based on this new understanding of the world and how it exists. So that applies to everything. It applies in sports. It applies to organizations where you get a new leadership comes in and they want to try and do new things. And it shakes up the people that have the old worldview, right? So paradigms of Thomas Kuhn, this is just an amazing stuff anyway. But there's a shifting. The worldview before this was all about emergency preparedness was related to what? It grew out of what field? Starts with an M. Military, right? So you had that military paradigm, which was very hierarchical structure, very much specifics. If this happens, then this, then this, then this. If this happens, then this, and this, and this. A very structured response to understanding that we need to have a broad response to issues, right? And so that's a shift in the paradigm. And one of the challenges, and your books makes great points of this, is that so many of the early people that came into the field of emergency management came out of where? Starts with an M. Military. Retired military people that brought all their background and experience from the military and applied that to the civilian world. And we're realizing that doesn't work. Because most organizations don't have that same hierarchical structure, right? You know, most organizations don't work in the military. You know, in the military you do it or, you know, you're in big trouble. You know, you don't really have that in a lot of organizations. So it's a shifting to this new paradigm. And this is all based on Drabek, Dr. Thomas Drabek, discussed on 77 and 78 in your text. And he talks about three basic elements that are moving us toward this new paradigm. We're not there yet. We've still got the battle taking place. We've still got a lot of people whose whole career and professional experience is based on a certain worldview. And when somebody comes along and shatters that, I mean, look, and why is that important? Look at the shift toward distance learning. Some people embrace the opportunity, and others don't like it at all, rather than trying to adjust and adapt to things. And that's what paradigms require us to do, is make a choice. You know, we stuck with the old way of doing things, and we're willing to try new stuff. Kind of like our exercise of looking up stuff without going to using the internet. That was fun, wasn't it? Yeah, right. So this toward this new paradigm, so pay particular attention to these couple pages in your text. This idea of professionalism, that it's not just other duties as assigned responsibility. It's not just give it to somebody and, okay, you got the title, make it happen. It's this idea of making sure that people we put in emergency management positions have what? Background, have education, you know, have training, have certification, have a broad knowledge. Because again, we've talked about the growth of what's added to our new understanding of emergency management, social science research. Understanding those aspects, understanding the role of sociology and psychology. And if you've been reading the news or seeing news reports the last several days, it's just been a massive increase in the number of adolescents, you know, seeking professional mental health because the change to distance learning, the isolation is having impacts. So this idea of professionalism gets to be very important in terms of training, in terms of experience that you bring into it. And then individual qualities, and your text goes in greater detail on these things. But what do you think would be some good qualities you would want to have of somebody in emergency management? People skills. Why people skills? Okay, but more specifically, goes back to our other C word we used. Yeah, and so that needs people skills, right? We need to know that people respond better when asked rather than when told, right? We understand tact. We understand all those kind of things. So those interpersonal skills become very critical in a position that's predominantly one of what? Coordinating, get other people to buy into what it is you're trying to do. So those kind of individual qualities. So the professionalism as in technical expertise and these individual qualities. And then emergency management activities, and again, those are evolving, and again, the text talks a great deal about those things to go. But this idea that we're shifting away from the military perspective to a civilian away from a very incident related to more general applications of what goes on. This idea of understanding the importance of coordination and cooperation and collaboration, if you will, among the different groups. And all that's a big shift, and so we have to get away from those people that see it almost from a very structured, hierarchical military approach to one of a collaboration that takes place. And that's going to take time to evolve as we move forward. But again, pay particular attention to those couple pages in your text. I think I've said that enough that you ought to realize that's a clue. Okay, as you move forward. Okay. The new paradigm also includes this idea of emergency management viewed as a distributive process rather than a discrete function. What does all that mean? Danelle, I see you have it on the tip of your tongue. How'd that do for 9:30 in the morning?
I don't know.
Okay. Eight.
Coordinating. It's literally coordinating with others instead of going, wait, do this, do that, do this. It's more, hey, can you all deal with this issue, and we'll deal with this issue, and let's come back together and get everything done.
So, and again, this is one of those examples where don't get amazed by the word. Just look at the definition. Distributive process is a process that what? Distributes the workload, right? And nothing fancy about it. It just sounds better if I say distributive process than a process that distributes. Same function though, right? You distribute responsibility, you distribute functions that goes on. And discrete functions are functions that are discrete. And what does discrete mean?
Separate from everyone else, by yourself.
Kind of, sort of.
Specific.
Pardon me?
Specific.
More standalone. A discrete function is one that's in and of itself. And so again, what you see in this idea is distributive processes would be what? Strategic or tactical? You had a 50% chance of being right. Strategic, good answer, right? It's more strategic. And why strategic?
I guess because it plans out and it distributes resources.
Yeah, exactly. And the functions would be more tactical because it's, again, specifically related to when this happens, do these things. And so, again, this idea that we talked about in the first 3 chapters, this difference in our approach, whether it's strategic or tactical, both have a role to play. But what the articles suggest, what the video we saw the first day of class suggests, what your text suggests, is that that's not what's going to work anymore. There's so much more involved now. Oh, did you get my email, by the way, about catching up on what you missed? Okay. And I'll get that posted later tonight or tomorrow, so you can just go back online to catch up. And then let me know if you have any questions about it. So this idea, again, back to those terms we use, and so much of what we're trying to do in this class is give you that basic vocabulary. And so this difference between strategic and tactical is critical in a number of elements. Make sure to review figure 4.2 on page 79. Okay. And if you've got your text, go ahead and have a look-see. It's emergency management. Definition, vision, mission, principles. And we talked about at the end of the last chapters this idea of coming up with commonly accepted definitions of terms. And so what this is kind of an accepted definition. So the definition, emergency management is a managerial function charged with creating the framework within which communities reduce vulnerability to hazards and cope with disasters. So emergency management is the managerial function. And we'll talk about it. Have any of you ever heard the term pause to corp? Pause to corp? Okay, well, it's one of the abbreviations they use predominantly in business, where they talk about the processes or the steps in management. I got a slide coming up on that to do those. But what it talks about, it gives the definition of what emergency management is. What's the difference between a vision and a mission? Yes, sir.
Vision is what you wish you can do, and mission is what you're going to do.
I mean, close, but for what purpose is the mission there?
Inform people what their job is in the situation.
More fundamental than that. You said it already, but you need to use different words. Which comes first, the vision or the mission? Huh? The vision. Why is that important? Again, you've already said it. I'm just trying to put it in slightly different words. So a vision tells us what? Where we want to go, what we want to be when we grow up, how we want to see the future evolve. And then the mission supports that vision by doing what? Explaining what we're going to do in support of achieving that vision. And those of you that are interested in leadership programs, this is also an important difference. The role of a leader is to reinforce the vision and keep that in front of the organization. And the view of the manager is to what? Make sure the mission gets accomplished. Do their job in accomplishing what it is you're trying to achieve with your vision. And you see that if any of you have ever been involved in strategic planning processes or going to get involved in strategic planning, that's one of the first things you do. What's your vision? Well, if you were to leave in 10 years and come back, what would you like the organization to look like? A vision for Newberry College. If you were to go away in 10 years and come back, what would you like to see the college doing? Right? That's your vision. That's what you want it to look like. And then the mission is, okay, fine, what are we going to do on a daily basis to move us in the direction of accomplishing that? Right? And then the term that gets involved in your text doesn't talk a great deal, doesn't use the term specifically, but this is an idea called alignment, which says that your vision and your mission have to be aligned and that they're moving for the same purpose. And that anytime you look at decisions that are made within an organization, how does it fit our vision? How does it support moving us in the direction of accomplishing that? So it's again those terms that get a whole lot of fluff about them, but they're really quite simple. What's success? Which is your vision, right? And how are you going to know when you get there? That's your mission. Keeping track of those things. We call it different words, but it's really very straightforward. And then you're seeing more and more in the literature, they call it here principles. Other terms you'll see that carry the same basic meaning as this idea of values. But this idea of emergency management must be comprehensive. We've talked about in a lot of ways. Have to be progressive, which means you have to be anticipatory. You can't be prepared to fight yesterday's disaster. You learn from it and move forward. Has to be risk-driven. Right? You have to be able to do risk analysis, risk assessment. You do that in sports all the time. Right? What happens if somebody gets hurt? What happens if they change? What happens if and you plan for those things up ahead of time. Field hockey. Although it's a game I have yet to understand. I used to think that cricket was a confusing game. But cricket is kindergarten compared to field hockey. I'm sorry. I mean, you guys know what you're doing. It's an amazing game. But anyway. So yeah, risk. And so another big area within organizations is risk management. The Association of Counties actually has a whole department that works with organizations on assessing risk. What can you do to prevent it? And so that's a much narrower, but it's the same thing in effect as emergency planning, isn't it? What's the potential risk that's going to happen? What can we do to minimize the impact that it has? If it does happen, how do we get over it and move forward? It's just on a smaller scale than we have with emergency preparedness, emergency management. This idea of collaboration we've talked about. This idea of coordination we've talked about. This idea of flexibility, which is again away from tactical and into strategic. And again, this notion of professionalism. We need to have people that have professional expertise, not just in the military. We call them SLJOs. And I won't tell you exactly what it meant. But Okay, how about stupid little jobs officer? They would take junior officers and all the committees and stuff nobody wants to serve on. That's your job, right? And that's what too oftentimes happens. Oh, we got to have an emergency manager. Okay, Richard, you're going to be the emergency manager. Whether you have background, experience, interest is irrelevant, right? And that's what they're talking about here. When you get away from those days where it's just given to somebody because we have to have an emergency manager, to somebody who knows what they're talking about, who has a little background and expertise. So again, this is full of nice test questions, so I'd make sure I review 4.2 when you go through to deal with these things. Your text talks about, starting on page 80, this idea of sequential management functions. And for those of you that are in business, if you haven't heard the term pause to corp, you're going to hear it today and you'll know what it is when you hear it later on. But the functions they talk about, planning, organizing, directing, controlling, as the management functions within emergency, are just a subset of this whole idea of pause to corp. And I think reality, when you see what's included in the larger context, that really is a more accurate reflection of what a professional emergency management group has to do, right? So know what planning is, right? That pretty comfortable what planning means. Organizing, pretty much sense. Directing. What's in between directing and controlling?
Point people in the direction, but you don't like helicopter. You don't helicopter over them. You know, like
That's one way to look at it. Have you ever heard the term in a military perspective, trust but verify? You ever heard that term? See that with a lot of treaties and stuff. Yeah, we trust they're going to do it, but we're still going to make sure they're doing it. So directing is basically trust but verify. This is what we need to do, but then go back to make sure it's getting done. That's that oversight of controlling function that takes place. And again, your text has a nice discussion on pages 80 and 81 that talks about that in a little bit detail. But as I suggested, it's part of this larger thing of pause to corp, which is planning, organize, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. A lot bigger function. And so why I think this is a bit better way, rather than just using the 4 that your text mentions, is we have the planning, we have the organizing, we have the directing, and we have the coordinating. Controlling, rather. Okay? But why might the emergency manager be involved with staffing? Yeah, exactly. You know, in a lot of organizations, you're going to have support staff. So what are the qualifications we need? And again, you know, that's taken a much broader perspective, but staffing is critical. Okay. Directing, we've talked about. Coordination, we've talked about in a lot of ways. But reporting, we talked about that earlier in one of the functions, right? But that's ideally, from a management perspective, an important part of what managers do. They gather the data and they report on what's seen. In the military, they call it after-action reports. You know, in any organization, after a game, one of the things you probably go through is talk about the good things and the bad things that happened during the game, right? And then you move on from there, an after-action report. Budgeting. And this is going to be an issue, not necessarily today, because, as we said, too often they're part of the sheriff's department or a police department or whatever, and so their budgets are included. But as they become larger and more professional, they have to then be responsible for budgeting. What kind of budget do you need? What budget do you need for staffing? What about equipment, material, things of that nature? So it's just a subset, but I think this idea of pause to corp and this planning, organized, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, budgeting gives a much broader view of if we're moving toward professional emergency management and professional emergency managers, you got to take that somewhat broader view. So if you ever ask a question about the management functions At a minimum, you should be able to list the 4 that's in your text. The little extra points would be fitting it into this larger notion of what Positive Corp is all about. Again, this doesn't specifically talk about budgeting, but if you ever put together an activity of any kind, one of the first questions I ask is, how much is it going to cost? Where are you going to get the money from? So that becomes an issue longer term. So again, from a test perspective, knowing the 4 that are in the book are terrific, but being able to link them into this larger concept will make a difference as we go through. Questions on that? And again, it's elevating this role of emergency manager from tactical, right, to strategic. It's understanding that those functions are just that, functions that we talked about. They're not necessarily the direct responsibility of the emergency manager. They need to be responsible to get those things done, but they can get staff, they can get volunteers, they can coordinate with other groups to make those things happen. They get to be important. And when we get into this idea, and this is the big difference between emergency preparedness, which is a very tactical verb, or combination of words, to emergency management, which is a much more strategic view. So this idea of this shift in paradigm, the shift in perspective, this is movement away from very incident-specific reactions to having a broad that gives you the flexibility to respond and adapt with your emergency plan. A bit different. Questions? Okay. Perspective. Your text talks about this, and I really like this idea. What does it mean to be value added to the community as opposed to being a discrete function? We've already talked about functions that are discrete, so you ought to have that in your vocabulary, right? But what does it mean, value added? Charlotte, any thoughts? What does value added mean? Okay. Other thoughts? Okay. So what do you think value added means?
A plus, like something positive.
Yeah, a positive. It's like you could get a job and you've got more qualifications than what they need. That's extra value they're getting for it. So you bring more than just the minimum qualifications to meet the job. You have value added because you have prior experience, right? You know, in athletics, if you've had prior experience as a coaching or working with assistant coaching, that's value added because that elevates what you can do on the field, right? So this notion of making it value added, not a discrete function. It's this idea that if we simply look at emergency management and emergency preparedness in a very narrow focus, where we're just responding to whatever's right coming down the road, we miss this idea to understand that when you move into a community, when a business moves into a community, when an industry moves into a community, might they be interested in your plans you have in place to deal with disasters? Might they be interested in the infrastructure you have available to help support them? That becomes value added. They don't come to you necessarily for that specific reason, but it adds something that somebody else might not have. Does that help a little bit understand what this value added means? Because again, it's a change in perspective from, yeah, okay, go and we'll do this when it happens, to this idea of having this comprehensive plan adds value to what you give to the community. Right? You give this external realization that you're in position to have resources available, that it's not just an ad hoc function that you give to somebody. You're actually taking these things very seriously in what you do. And your text talks about that in much greater length. But this notion of viewing management as a value added. And again, that's a unique shift in the paradigm, in the perspective we've had on it. And the extent to which you're able to do that, you're ahead of the curve. We've also talked a little bit already about this idea of risk management. And risk management, again, is just kind of the subset of emergency management, right? Because in emergency management, you're looking at emergencies, disasters, external events that can happen that can have damage to into the community. Risk management, you're looking at a much more specific level, at a much smaller level. So risk management could include such things as making sure all of your people are properly trained and certified on the equipment they operate. Make sure everybody understands how to use a ladder. I mean, it sounds silly, right? But there's a way to do a ladder. There's a way to make sure that it's leveled properly before you start climbing it. It's important to know that you have somebody around in case you fall to protect. What can happen? What happens with our equipment? Risk management can be also as simple as preventive maintenance. What's preventive maintenance? Maintenance of, you see, you got this. This is cool, right? Right? It's maintenance that's done beforehand to help eliminate the possibility you change your oil on a routine basis. Not necessarily because it needs it, but because, right, it's a preventive maintenance step you can take. And one of the problems, just like emergency management writ large, when budget gets tough, what are one of the first things they cut out? Preventive maintenance, because it's seen as low-hanging fruit. And yet preventive maintenance, I get oil changed on all of my cars at a minimum once a year, regardless of the mileage. Why? Because we all know from dealing with vehicles that if they sit, moisture condensation could get in the oil and the other parts. So it's a cheap enough way to prevent those things from happening. Yes, sir.
What kind of cars you got?
What day is it? I get fussed at all the time. I have 6 cars. And the reason is I don't have 7 because I have to rest one day. I have a 1958 MGA restored. It's a 2-seater British sports car. Wooden floorboards, no door locks, 57 horsepower. 4-speed transmission with no synchronizers in reverse or first. So it's a hoot to drive. I've got a 1984 Porsche 911 Carrera, 3.2 Carrera, which is kind of on the opposite spectrum of my MGA. I've got a 2006 BMW 325 CI convertible, which is kind of my daily driver. I've got a 2011 Porsche Boxster. I've got a pickup truck because everybody that lives in the country needs to have a pickup truck. And I lease a new Honda Accord every 3 years, so I have a new car to drive when I need one. You know? And I also have 2 tractors and 3 riding lawnmowers and but anyway, that's another whole nother story. But you know, you have the right tool for the right time, kind of thing. Yeah, that's a good segue, right? Is having the right tool and equipment in case of emergency. So if it's a sunny day, that's an emergency that I don't need to drive a hardtop. I need to drive a convertible. That's kind of my segue, and I'm sticking to it. Now, I may actually drive the MGA in on Thursday. It's supposed to be a pretty day in the 70s, so I may drive it in the morning. But anyway, so risk management is this whole idea of it's emergency management taken at a much smaller level. What kind of training, what kind of certification do we have going on? And you know, it's have you ever heard they have this public works rodeo every year in South Carolina? You heard about that? What do we know about it?
Are you talking about the rodeo that's here?
Yeah, the equipment rodeo.
Oh, no.
No? Every year, Department of Transportation gets equipment operators from all over the state to go a rodeo. And have you ever seen people run a backhoe? Those guys are magicians. I mean, I've got a front end loader on my tractor, and I end up gouging most stuff. But those guys are just the way they can handle them. It's just anyway. That ties into risk management because when people driving those things need to be aware of what's going on, right? Need to be able to use those things. And then you also, when an accident happens, you do an investigation as to why. Not so much to blame somebody, but what can we do in the future to prevent the same kind of accident? So little things like putting a sign up when there's water on the floor is risk management. You're informing people there's a potential risk going on. So, But again, perspective, words matter as we go forward. So this idea of shifting from discrete functions to a value added elevates the role that emergency management can have in your community and elevating your community to the next level for attracting businesses, industries, things of that nature. Okay. What does the very top of this slide say?
Make sure to review.
Yeah, what might that mean?
Write it down.
Yeah, so what you've got on here are three nice little figures that help out a lot. And again, I would never ask you to do all of them, but a good question is, emergency managed program functions, your text lists X number, talk about any 2 or 3 of them. Okay, and what that talks about is basic elements. And again, this notion of functions. They are not the responsibility of the emergency manager in terms of delivering the services, right? But they are a responsibility of the emergency manager to make you have resources available that can provide these functions. And this comes critical when you start looking at staffing issues as to what qualifications individuals bring to the job. One of the other elements that your text talks about is this idea of professional development. And this is from FEMA's curriculum of series of areas that you need to have study. And what you've seen in your text talks a lot about is the increase in the number of certification programs, the increase in the number of college programs, and I think your text even mentions, as of its writing, there's already one college at least that offers a PhD in emergency management. Again, understanding the complexities of what goes on and shifting it away from people who come from a military or other world environment into this new world that we're looking at things. And from a paradigm shift is often the case, is the people that were under the old school don't see as much value in having this professional education, professional training. And that's one of those paradigm shifts that will take place. Characteristics of successful organizations. And so one of the things I particularly like on that list is all hazard approach. Just in thinking about the words, what might an all hazard approach to emergency management mean? Yeah, a general plan that allows the flexibility to adapt as needed to a particular incident. Again, away from tactical to strategic, away from incident-based to a broader perspective of what emergency management is and can do in the process as we go through. So again, spend a bit of time looking over. If you have questions, I'll be glad to talk about them next time. But some of these, again, functions, it's the importance of understanding that these are not the direct responsibility. They're not discrete functions, if you will, of the emergency manager, but they are functions for which the emergency management has to have a plan in place, have to have resources in place to make things happen. And you see that's very similar to the other list we've talked about. Professional development series, and that's those broad areas, and a lot of these are certification programs that take place. And these organizational characteristics. And another way of putting that is, for anybody from a business background, are things called best practices. What works best in organizations and how they work and they move forward as we go through. And then, this starting on page 84, talks about this toward professionalization. And it goes into a great deal of discussion about what it means to be a profession as opposed to a discipline. You know, what it means to be a profession rather than somebody that does it as an avocation. And it goes a great deal. And so what they're saying is, as just a discipline of emergency management, emergency preparedness, they talk at great length about the increasing number of college degree programs that focus on emergency management. And here at Newberry College, doing this as part of that, right, public and not-for-profit management. No matter what organization you go into, as I mentioned, I'm on the board of a disabilities and special needs. We have an emergency preparedness plan for how we not only deal internally with challenges that come up, but how externally coordinate with other disabilities and special needs organizations to make sure we can share our resources with them and they can share their resources with us. Text talks about also the increasing number of emergency management certification programs. There are all kinds of them that are done at the college level, at the organizational level. In some states, the state emergency preparedness division has them, FEMA has them. You know, it's like any other certification you get that said you've had extra training and background in these particular areas. And again, there's been an increase in those as well. So not only from a college perspective, a degree perspective, but from a professional development perspective, this idea. And then another sign of this increasing professionalism is mentions a couple journals specifically that are focused on that. Why that gets to be important is when you get down to putting together your emergency plan, these are great resources to go back and look at to move forward as we go on those things. And I guess the final one is this idea, it talks about toward being a profession. And it talks about a couple key elements of being considered a profession. And one is it required certification. And what that means is you have to have some document that indicates you have the managerial and technical expertise background to be successful in your job. So doctors need to have certification. Dentists need to have certification. Does your auto mechanic have to have certification? No. There are all kinds of backyard mechanics that can fix your cars in a skinny minute, right?
Well, mine in my city, yes.
Right, but so that's the difference between a backyard mechanic and somebody who's a professional. Is most dealerships and most major manufacturers want all of your mechanics to go through their certification programs. There are a lot of people that say they can work on my Porsche, but there are only a few people I'd let touch it because you've got to have that professionalism. So certification of some kind, and whether that's a college degree or professional certification programs, that's got to be there. You have to have some required minimum qualifications, and up until 15, 20 years ago, there were no minimum qualifications to be a county coroner. Anybody who decided to want to run for coroner could run. And then they realized, well, perhaps we need to have some kind of minimum requirements. And that comes along as they become more professional. And this third one is this idea of universal acceptance. And that gets to be important because we can have all these kind of things, but if it's not accepted as being critical to being effective in your position, what difference does it make? If it doesn't matter to you or to your organization whether you have any certification to become an emergency manager, right? And again, the challenge is, should that be a barrier? And toward this profession is where a lot of, and your text talks about this, one of the biggest challenges they have is people who have experience without certification and without any kind of degree that say, well, should my experience be worth something? And the argument, yes, it is. But the reality is not so much the amount of experience you have, but the variety of experience you have. So that's why if any of you are taking Professor Ringer's public personnel policy and you do interviews and you're interviewing people for a job or other ways, that's why it becomes critical that you ask open-ended questions. It allows them, not ask them, have you ever done this, but give me an example where you've done this. Again, one's a yes or no answer, the other one requires you to talk. So that's what Chapter 4 talks about. It's a relatively short, 20 some odd 30 pages in length. But again, it talks about this evolution that's taking place within the field of emergency management, emergency preparedness, away from the military perspective, which is very tactical and hierarchical, to a more strategic approach that understands the importance of collaboration, collegiality, and whatnot that goes on. And this idea that we need to take emergency management away from just discrete events to having a much more broader perspective of the role that emergency management plays on the quality of life, which ties into this value-added perspective of what emergency management and a good emergency management plan and the benefits it brings to the organization. Whether it ever needs to be implemented or not, the fact that it's done, that it's well thought through, that you've got plans in place, become a good selling point, that value added approach that goes on. So this, again, this move from just an other duties as assigned approach to professionalism and managerial responsibility. Ta-da. Questions, comments? Is this good for you? I mean, lots of stuff. Make sure to review those tables because those are all good game for talk to me about 2 or 3 of them on an exam perspective. And again, the broader sense of this evolution that's continued away from military to a civilian or community approach that takes place. So for Thursday, we'll begin on Chapter 5. Do that Thursday and the following Tuesday. That following Tuesday, the 28th, we have the Chief of Security here at Newberry College coming in to talk a bit about. Please be prepared to ask questions, either that you have prepared or based on something he says during his presentation. That would be a good thing to have. Review what the requirements are for your first critical review essay. If you have any questions, we'll talk about those on Thursday. Let me know so that those of you that want to get started and get it done early. And remember, the exam is going to be on the 5th. It'll be online in chapters 4, 5, and 6. Yes, sir.
When are we doing the radio thing again?
You haven't told me a date, so I'm going to pick a date, and the other folk isn't here, so we'll wrap that up. So we've got the 4 of you that are doing the presentation. Yeah. Charlotte, you excited about this? Work with me. I have confidence in you. Yeah. Aiden and Owen, I know, will be dynamite. I'm looking forward to that. And what we'll do is a talk, but it's basically prepare, 3-4 minutes of what you would tell your parents or your significant other that they need to make sure they deal with the emergencies coming. And we may want to say somebody talk about a hurricane, somebody talk about a tornado, somebody talk about whatever we want to do. We can structure that as we get closer. But we'll give Dr. Roost a date by Thursday, and it'll be after the exam toward the end of October. We decided we wanted it on a Monday rather than a Friday.
It's in the morning, right?
Yeah, 9 o'clock. And you will all get that official letter saying you're excused from classes that morning to participate in a school-sponsored event.
Y'all want to do Friday?
Okay, so I'll just coordinate with Dr. Roost and make it happen.
Whatever works.
Yep. Okay, well, thanks a lot.